Thank you all for joining me for this super quick lightning talk, all 6 of you. This was a fun one I just kind of threw together, so I'm really glad you all are here for this. Hopefully someone finds this useful. My name is Zaneski. I'm a staff software engineer at a company called Defense Unicorns. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I am a tech lead for the Kubernetes project, and I work on bombctl and protobomb, which, if you're interested in those, come to my next talk, which is in 20 minutes in this room. I just want to quickly define what the public sector is here. Public sector being not necessarily US government, but pretty much any sort of government work, whether you're working with the government directly, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, for example, the Department of Defense, any sort of like public work that you're doing that isn't tied to like the private industry. And why should folks care about the public sector? Well, I think there's a couple good reasons to start with. It's okay to not care about the public sector as well. I know there's a lot of folks out there who don't necessarily want their open source projects being used by the military. I think I felt like that at one point, and then I kind of learned a lot more and grew up a bit. So, but it's totally okay to still be there. You're paying for it right now, I think, is one of the biggest ones. Like, your tax money is already funding a lot of this work. It's funding a lot of the different software projects that are happening throughout the DoD, throughout the government. And so, I don't know, I'd much rather be in a place where we are using the best things that we can and solving the best sorts of problems. And so the other side here is that people in the public sector are just trying to solve problems that everyone else is. And I think one of the biggest things that I realized is I'm very new to the public sector world. I joined this company back in January, so probably 10 months in at this point. But the idea that, you know, I always thought that like the government and the military were solving like very unique problems to them, and it turns out they're not. They're actually solving problems that, you know, the private industry probably solved like 6 months ago. But they're still in this place of, you know, needing to solve these problems. And again, some of them are unique, but they're not all super unique. And then, obviously, you should care because of national security, which might be kind of lame or controversial to talk about, but I think the idea that, at least here in the US, we have the ability to criticize our government with free speech, and I think that's super important and worth defending. And I think that to be able to do that, we need to understand a bit more about how it works so we can actually have a valid conversation. So that's kind of my thoughts and hot takes there. So with that out of the way, 5 things that you can actually do as an open source maintainer that open source folks can do to improve their projects to be consumed in open source. The first one I want to talk about is considering the environment. We've talked a bit about air gaps at this conference so far. Air gap software is the idea that we have software that's not connected to the public internet. You know, it might be running on a F-35 fighter jet, it might be running on a submarine in the ocean, might just be running in its own closet in the doctor's office for the, you know, Medicare. But there's all sorts of things that come into mind when you think about the air gap environment where a tool that might be used can't just kind of reach out to GitHub to download something, or can't just grab a file or a JSON file from somewhere. So really this idea that if we build our tooling, and it's very, it's adding options, say we're building a command line tool to just kind of say, hey, like, I'm gonna provide you a path to this file that you need to run, helps a long ways, where it's not dependent on the public internet to reach out for. So being able to kind of skip or preload or suggest the random sites or services that you need to in your tool, if you can make those changes, super helpful. Another one is ability to provide overrides for a lot of that stuff. It's really surprising when, you know, you go to use a tool and it just kind of starts reaching out to sites in the internet to grab stuff, or talking to things on your local network. So really adding those abilities and keeping that in mind. STIGs are another thing that get mentioned a lot in the government. They're kind of like security requirements. Like there's a STIG for running Linux on servers, or there's a STIG for Android tablets. And not necessarily like knowing and understanding all the specifics because they're hundreds and hundreds of pages long, but just knowing that like maybe the Android tablet can't turn on the camera, for example, or it doesn't have GPS, or fun environment that I've been working in, they aren't even allowed to set the system time on the Android tablet based on their STIG. So that was a new fun one where I had to go in and create certificates that were in the past invalid on these devices. So just kind of taking that in mind that like there are devices and restrictions out there where you might need to get a little creative, and keeping that in mind, and especially listen to feedback as it comes up. A lot of these folks also don't have sudo or admin access on their computer. Not super easy to install tools or use things that require root. So having an option to run rootless if possible is super helpful. And then FIPS is a big one. We talk about FIPS a bit. TLDR and FIPS is really just like secure certified cryptography libraries. Anyone a Go developer? Just me? Fun fact about Go, the next version of Go is hopefully having all of their in-house built crypto libraries certified for FIPS. So every Go application that you're going to compile with the next version of Go is hopefully going to be FIPS certified out of the box, which I think is a huge step forward. Yeah. And shout out to Filippo who's doing that work. Another one, so wrangle dependencies. Obviously dependencies, super important. We talk about that a lot. You're going to hear us talk about SBOMs quite a bit. Again, talk I'm giving in 20 minutes is about SBOMs for end users, so come right back if you want to. But providing a complete SBOM that has all the dependencies, it doesn't have like wildcard fields. And this is a big problem with like a lot of the SBOMs that are shipped and a lot of the current tooling is sometimes the fields just, the fidelity isn't there in the data that we're looking for. And so a lot of tooling, or we see this with CVEs a lot, where they just like wildcard the fields and then random scanners pick these things up and it just kind of breaks and throws red flags everywhere. So providing an SBOM for your project if you're shipping binaries or just about anything makes it super helpful. This is a lot of regulations, requirements around that. Fixing your CVEs is a big one. Set up something like the Pendabot. Really helpful to get those high CVEs just knocked out of your project. Hopefully most of the time it's just a quick like merge if it's a minor version bump or a patch. Obviously major versions are much harder, but there's a lot of open source projects out there that just kind of like let those Dependabot things stack up, and it helps a lot when you don't have to explain and list the CVEs on your security team spreadsheets for public stuff. And obviously, if dependencies being the root of all evil, as we've talked about recently, but really just trying to use less if possible. If something's built into the standard library or there's an easy way that you can wrap it with a very lightweight utility, always great to just kind of cut down on the surface there. What I've learned is that most of the government folks really care most about like lineage when it comes to these projects, like where do the contributors live. Kind of sucks, and it's a lot of bureaucracy. But really just like cutting back on dependencies helps in general with supply chain security. Another one I want to talk about is building community. So we talk about this a lot as open source maintainers. We have lots of empty seats at the table. And we would love for people from the public sector to come fill them, or any sector. If y'all aren't involved in any open source projects, like especially on Kubernetes, the #1 thing we need is not software engineers. We actually need people to come help organize and triage issues and some light PM work. So we have lots of empty seats at the table, and we want to fill those. So make those seats known for your folks out there that could join from the public sector. Actively seeking out participation is a good thing, but this gets very difficult because government isn't always open about like, hey, we're using your tool to work on submarines or something. But it's really finding a way to like build those communities, have those folks come through, maybe do some digging when people open issues to kind of figure out where they are. But once you've learned that folks from the government or are interested in using your tools, it's great to seek them out and try to engage them more, just like everyone else. Engage and listen to issues and feedback. Like I said, when people are filing issues, try to understand what they're trying to solve, maybe ask probing questions, dig deeper. But building a sense of community around your project and making it inclusive for folks to come in. And I think this was very eye-opening for me. I was at Hill Air Force Base working with the 309 software engineering group. And I'm one of the maintainers for kubectl, so the command line tool for Kubernetes. And someone there, they were a government civilian, they're like, hey, like, if you guys made this one change, it would make my day-to-day life 100% better. It's like, cool, let's go make that change. Like, that's real easy for us to do. And so I did a change, pull requested it, had someone approve it. And he's like, I didn't realize it was that easy. I was like, yeah, like, you asked me in person, but you could just file this on GitHub, and Yeah, these are the types of things. So I think a lot of people in the public sector don't know that they can just kind of go to open source projects and open issues, open feature requests. There's a lot when it comes to acquisitions and making demands to vendors, but open source is about community. Next thing is talking about docs. Obviously, docs are super hard to write and do well. I think there's a couple types of documentation that would really help folks in the public sector, and that's providing a consumer-level architecture doc of what you're doing. So not necessarily like digging into the super deep roots of how things are technically working, but the very high-level overview of like, here's all the services that are needed. This needs to talk to a database, right? A lot of that stuff is just like assumed when you're coming into a project, but very lightweight documents like this help a ton, especially government folks need to do something called an ATO, authority to operate. So basically there's a person who has the ultimate authority who needs to go and sign off and approve the usage of something, and they might not always necessarily be technical themselves. So they're trying to approve technology decisions when they don't actually understand the choices at stake. And I'm sure Camden can tell us all about this later. Another one is documenting goals and non-goals. Like, it's totally okay for your tool to not be designed to run in an air-gapped environment or somewhere else. So if you set out with like specific goals in mind, it's always great to list those in your README and just having an understanding of like, hey, like the purpose of this tool was this, and if there's something you definitely don't ever want to implement, it's okay to call that out as a non-goal. And I think the last point I wanted to talk about is this concept of building public trust. I'm going to show you 2 quick GitHub profiles, and I want you all to tell me which one you would trust more to either take a contribution from or use a dependency from. So this is my coworker. Nothing against them. They are a part of our growth team, but they have a GitHub profile. They've got their username and not many contributions. And this is mine, and this is not meant to humble brag or show off at all, and I really want to kind of dig into that little left side there. Like, you can see I just have my real name there. I have some of my other social stuff, where I kind of live in the world, what time zone I'm in. All of these things help immensely with kind of building this like graph of your social trust out there. And I mentioned that when it comes to open source, like lineage is very, very important for a lot of these organizations to kind of like understand where the contributor's coming from, who's kind of got ownership. Supply chain attacks are super rampant. So I think the TLDR of this is don't have anime girl avatars if you can help it. And again, you don't necessarily have to make your you don't have to want to help the public sector, but if you do, having a regular profile picture or your full name or even just your location, any of those little details absolutely help kind of build your public trust. I think one of the interesting things about the XZ vulnerability that we almost happened, right? That was almost catastrophic, what almost happened a few months ago. And I found one of the most fascinating pieces is that the email address that the attacker had been using throughout the whole process of contributing to becoming a maintainer was, I think they had a vanity domain. It was just like their name at like something.com. That did not show up in any sort of data leaks or breaches over the past like 10 years. So they went through and they looked at all of the data dumps and all of like the exfiltrated data, and that email address, that domain name, didn't show up in any of them. And I think that type of thing is just like a very new vector of like a red flag that we can notice for. So just kind of make it easier for folks like this to connect the graph of your presence online. Again, not necessarily like you don't have to be very public, but any little thing you can do to kind of help build that trust is super useful. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or take any tomatoes or thoughts. We got about 5 minutes, I think. So, anyone? Yes.
So I think you said, something about kind of getting people with Kubernetes to help do issues and kind of the maintenance work. Do you have like a training program that like they're not a full maintainer maybe, but is there something that's like intermediate where it's like, issue contributor or something
Yeah.
that you use for that?
Yeah, great question. The question was, do we have any sort of like onboarding or training programs to get people involved in the project, specifically to Kubernetes? And the answer is yes, we've done a new contributor workshop at a bunch of KubeCons. We actually haven't done it recently. We also have all sorts of like mentoring cohorts that start up. LF has their own LF mentorship group too, which puts you on a project, which is really cool. So yeah, there are opportunities out there for sure. And we're actually up on time. We don't have those 5 minutes. So thank you all for listening to my TED Lightning talk.